book, a lie, in a world that changed forever. Imagine living in a world where a single book could turn your neighbor, your friend, and even your own family against you. Hey, good morning. This is Gary Watson, the Geezer, and I'm in Geezerville. And it's the beginning of a new year in January. And as promised, this video episode is episode 10 of the series that I began in 2025 called Echoes of Deception. Now, in the prior episode, episode 9, I told a story, a personal story about a friend I met, and it was my first encounter with a black person, a person of color. And that happened on the college campus that I attended in the late 60s, which is why, by the way, I'm a geezer. as we speak, you'll know that. Now, in that prior episode, I mentioned Percival Everett. He's an author that I just recently came across, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for a book called James. James was inspired by a book that was written 139 years before it, called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And these two books couldn't be more different, and yet they share a common thread. And that thread is that both of these authors crafted stories that illustrated how a lie, a false narrative that took hold in the early 17th century, affected an entire nation, and it defined it. And that country, of course, is the United States. And the lie itself was a social construct that was created by humans to justify enslavement, the ownership of classes of people by the rich and the powerful among us. Every now and then, a book hooks me, owing to its ability to capture the impact of such an enormous lie on all of humanity. Now, Huckleberry Finn was one of those books, but when I first read it, it had virtually no impact in terms of my ability to understand the lie that was being surfaced in Twain's book. I read that book as a young white boy, and I saw it as adventures of two boys kicking around on a river and floating down the Mississippi. What was behind the book, what was working in the book, was the exposure of a level of human discrimination that I just didn't appreciate. Now, I reread Huckleberry Finn 2 more times, once as an adolescent and once in a college course in Black literature with my friend Gregory James that I talked about earlier and was the subject of episode 9. Still, at that point in my life, I was a surface fisherman, as Ernest Hemingway might have explained it. I didn't really understand the depth of discrimination and systemic racism in this country. The country that I was born in was something I wasn't able to fully comprehend until about 50 years later. But when I read James and his 2024 reimagining of the story of Huckleberry Finn, I felt something much deeper. Not a sequel, not a retelling. It was more like a conversation across 139 years. I began to wonder, what if the very first words of a book determined who would get to speak, who would get to be heard, and whose humanity would be recognized? Well, let's find out. Welcome to episode 10, and I'm Gary Watson. When Mark Twain opens his book, Huckleberry Finn, which was written in 1884. What we see is a boy, and a boy that's struggling against rules, religion, and expectations. And it's not just a mental struggle. He's struggling against the widow Douglas, who tries to what Huck says, civilize me. And he spells it with Sivilized, civilize me. Then, about a century later, Percival Everett comes along and he decides to retell this story. And that's pretty large of an undertaking, because you got to remember, at this point, Huckleberry Finn is an iconic book. So not just anybody can come along and retell that story and hope to have not only a solid piece of literature, but a Pulitzer Prize winning piece at that. So he begins quite differently with Jim. Jim's still an enslaved man, but he speaks in his own voice, and you learn really quickly that he's intelligent, perceptive, and very deliberate. He's not really a supporting character as Huck would have him. He is at the center. He is the storyteller. And that's a stark contrast, because Huck narrates a world he doesn't fully understand. Jim, on the other hand, speaks to a world he knows all too well. And just like Huck's stumbling along, trying to avoid being civilized, and he's stumbling toward his own freedom. Jim, on the other hand, and James, calculates survival within a system designed to deny his humanity. Now, remember I mentioned Isabel Wilkerson at one point in her book Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent. Well, Isabel argues that America's social order has never been just about race. It's been a caste system that's rigid, enduring, and designed to keep some voices above and others beneath. And that's what's so great about these openings of the first two chapters, of the first chapter of each book. So now, what happens when we compare these stories in more detail? Let's find out. Now, as a writer, I know how critical the first and the last chapters are of any book. And certainly these two that I'm comparing now are no different. So let's go back a little bit to the first opening chapter. We'll start with Huck and the adventures of Huck Finn. He's more than eager to point out that you wouldn't much know him if you hadn't read this book by a guy by the name of Mark Twain, who wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. So he qualifies immediately his own status as a character. And he said, Mr. Twain, he didn't lie much. It was mostly true, whatever he said. And that's the thing of it, Huck says, most all of us lie a little bit, and that I guess is okay. But what he can't stand is those people, like he'll go on to talk about the widow Douglas, who try to civilize him. And so that's how Twain opens up the first chapter. He immediately places his main character in the story as someone who is trying to escape to go to a place that's nearly true. Now let's compare that with how Percival handles the opening of his book, James. He's a little different. He says at the very beginning, it's a rather abrupt opening, and he says, "Those little bastards out there in that tall grass, I see them," something like that. I'm not going to try to read it directly, but they're in the moonlight, and the moon is shining behind Huck and Tom, and they're hiding, sneaking up on James. But James, he sees them, but he doesn't let on. And immediately you begin to understand something is different here. James, or Jim, is far more intelligent than he was ever portrayed. He's a man who clearly understands what's going on, and he's not going to be fooled by these little kids out in the field. So that's how these authors introduce us to the central part of the story. You quickly learn that Jim knows Latin. He's playing these two kids off. He's playing a game with them. He knows about his status. He knows about his own humanity. And that difference between these two characters is just more than a structural thing. When I began to feel what this book was about, I had no idea how it was going to end. But being able to appreciate the design a writer takes to put into their first chapter, I was anxious to go to the end and find out how it ended. But I didn't do that. I kept reading the rest of the story. And I'm glad I did. And it began, I began for the first time to really understand how black slaves during that period of our history, and probably even into the future, people who are de facto caste members, they're put in the lowest caste by the color of their skin. That's kind of what we're in today. And trying to understand that and feel it, you get the notion that you're being played. And I think that was a brilliant move that Everett made. I mean, think about it. They did, people that were mistreated or put in the lowest caste in our society didn't just cave. They fought to educate themselves. They fought to understand their own humanity, and they put it out there. And that was a feeling that I had after I got into the story that I tried to really think about and project and empathize with. And I began to understand, I've had black friends who have told me about the time of the talk, when they sit down with their children and even today and have what they call the talk. And I didn't really understand or appreciate that. But put yourself in that position. How would you feel if you had to say to your child, the playing field isn't level? You're going to be discriminated against because you have black skin. And you're going to need to watch out, because you're never going to know for sure whether or not you're going to suffer the consequence of that and to your own safety. How do you make that conversation happen? And how do you feel as a parent about the fact that your kids were born in a container, and they had to pierce the openings of that container to get to a level playing field if they ever could. And that concept really stuck home. I want to end this particular part of this story, of this episode, with a comment about something Isabel Wilkerson said about caste. She said, caste is not about feeling, it's about structure. She compares it to an old house. You didn't build it, but you inherit the floor plan. Think about that. And unless you see the rot in the foundation, you keep living with the cracks in the walls. I thought that was a brilliant capture. And after reading James, I know that Everett saw the cracks, and he wants to make sure that we do too. I would just love to meet the man. I would love to understand his perspective on living, on living in the past 50 years, the same time I did, but oblivious to everything that was going on around me, and oblivious to the fact that this whole structural caste system really defined America, the country I thought quite the contrary, the country that I thought the playing field was one of where merit made a difference and the only difference. How naive was I? And I pursued my dreams. I thought it was level. I thought if you worked hard, you could get ahead in whatever that meant. But that's certainly not the case, and not the case back in the time of slavery, not the case in the time of Reconstruction, and certainly not from the time of the 40s almost up to the 60s, and I'll argue up to the present day. We've never gotten out of this, and we've never been able to shed our caste. The books end entirely differently. Huck is off to a new territory. He's not being civilized by anybody anymore. He's free. In Percival's book, it's not quite the same for James. He's traveling to Ohio. No, that's wrong. He's traveling to Iowa. Sorry about that. And he's traveling along with 4 or 5 other companions, slaves, black. And they're stopped by a sheriff. And when they get stopped by a sheriff who is suspicious of why they're there, the sheriff asks them, and I have to look at my notes. The sheriff stops him and he says, "Any of you named Nigger Jim?" James steps up and he said, "I am James." And the sheriff says, "James what?" And in an extremely powerful way, using capital letters, Percival has Jim answer the sheriff and say, "Just James." 2 words that blast through all of the discrimination that he has faced all his life. He's no longer a sidekick. He's his own man. I think what I learned from this book and the story I'm trying to share now is one that I think Twain and Everett taught us, that the American story is really one that's told from one point of view. And because I've read Isabel Wilkerson's book before and then again after I read James, Wilkerson teaches us that these 2 authors, what they were talking about wasn't just bias. It was structural. It was institutional. It was based on and reinforced by our schools, our politics, our culture, our language, everything. In fact, there was a part of Wilkerson's story that I remember. I don't know, it was midway through the book or something, and she's at some sort of a conference and she meets another black woman who I believe was from Africa. The woman makes a statement to Isabel and she said, "There are no black people in Africa." And of course, Isabel is taken back by that, as would I. I mean, there are black people all throughout Africa. And the woman says, "No, that's not true. Black became their designation when they came to the US or the UK. The people that came, the people that were captured and abducted, those people would describe themselves as Yoruba, Igbo, Andale. They were tribes. That's how they identified themselves. And they became black only when they set foot on ships that brought them to the United States. Just as Jim becomes nigger Jim, and I use that word openly in respect for the authorship and the authenticity of these books, not because of who he is, but because of who the world wanted him to be. That took me many decades to really internalize into my own view of our caste system in the United States. And that's the echo. That's what's reverberated over time. And Twain, he was able to crack the door open in showing that a white boy was struggling with his conscience, perhaps. But Everett walks through the friggin' door and he changes the locks. And he reminds us that the oppressed don't need permission to be free. They just need the space to speak their voice. And unless we're able, collectively, as a people, to change that story, the structure will stay. I'm absolutely convinced of it. The structure will stay. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was one that perhaps doesn't fit the pattern of past episodes, but it was a perspective that I think I needed to share, and it's certainly consistent with the themes. In any case, I hope you'll look forward now to episode 11. And if you get a chance, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment and subscribe. It helps me build a channel and keep telling these stories that go from 1487 to our current time, 2026. So, as always, I'll end this by hoping that you have a great day and that you take the time and make some hope and share it with others as we begin the new year. Thanks a lot for your time and attention.